Okay.
Yeah, that's good to know that we're on the record here.
We're on the record. Yeah. Okay, well, welcome everybody to the third installment of Peatland Ecology and Botany with Berg. This is a naturalist workshop series that Homer Drawdown has been offering to provide our community with tools, knowledge, and skills that enable a deeper connection to the landscape, both from peatlands and beyond. So there are many other enrichment opportunities with the Drawdown project, including arts advocacy and education. So if you haven't heard of those, I will drop the website link in the chat soon here. And as I said, this is the third installment of this workshop, and we'll pick up where we left off last time. And if you missed the first two or any one of them, you can watch those recordings. They're found on our website at the bottom of the page. It's at the footer of the website. There's a button that says watch recordings, and you can follow that. And the full slideshow is also available to view and to download in the blog section of our website as well. So again, I'll share that information in the chat box in just a moment. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ed Berg. Ed is a retired ecologist with the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, but still very clearly engaged and active in his passions of geology, ecology, climate change, and paleogeography. And if you want to learn more from Ed, he's offering 2 college courses this fall, including the geology of Ketchimak Bay starting September 5th and global climate change starting October 10th. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we can see if we can raise Ed to answer them. And also just a reminder to please keep your mic muted if you're not talking. Okay, just announcement to our next Drawdown monthly meeting is on June 17th. You're welcome to join, and we have several other working group meetings in the meantime. And you can find all of our schedule and the links to the meeting on our website. So without further ado, take it away, Ed.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kim. Yeah, looking over these slides, I see I've got quite a potpourri of things here that really are not organized in any particular way, but they're things that I think you should know about if you're going to be out there in the peatlands looking at things. So just go with the flow here. So I left off, I guess I was starting to talk about some of the rusts that we see. So I've got a few slides on these, and these are kind of alarming when you meet them. And one of the most alarming ones is this spruce needle rust here, which if this pops up in your front yard, could turn your spruce tree really, quite yellow looking, especially when the fungal structures open up and release the yellow spores. So like most of these rusts, there are 2 plants involved. There's a host and a co-host. So in this case, there's Labrador tea is the co-host here. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner there how the leaves look when they are infected with the spruce needle rust. And those lesions, I guess, for want of a better term, will open and spores will come out, and they will land on the spruce tree and create the fungal infection. So let's see. I think, yeah, just going back one. So this is the broadleaf Labrador tea, and that's one of the hosts, and then there's the narrow-leaf Labrador tea. So both of those can be hosts for this needle rust. The good news is that the trees generally survive this. This is not a fatal problem, so don't panic if this pops up in your yard. But whole areas of the forest can be turned yellow, basically, with this. Well, here's kind of a favorite plant here, kinnikinnick. Has good berries. I'm showing the regular bearberry here, but there's also a redder berry, a different species. But this can be the host now for spruce broom rust. And here's spruce broom rust, which we have a fair number of. Once again, this is generally not fatal to the tree, although I suppose if you had a number of these in one tree, it might be fatal, but generally you only see one or two. So these rusts have the amazing capacity to take over the cell division process in the tree and create this prolific branching, for instance, in this particular case here. So all of these things are like cancer. I mean, something has taken over the normal cell division and cell differentiation, specialization process, and made it do something different. So in this case, it's producing a whole lot more branches. But it's just like cancer in the body. The cancer is producing a whole lot more cells, and therefore you've got a tumor. So these essentially are tumors. But again, the trees normally survive this. Well, now I'm going to introduce you to one that took me a long time to find out about. So here is a normal bog rosemary plant, Andromeda bullifolio. I love that name, Andromeda. This is, as I say, bog rosemary, but this is not the kind of rosemary that you use in cooking. Do not eat this one. This is very toxic. It's kind of one of the few toxic things we have around, and it's kind of got a bad name because it sounds like a spice. Well, I had noticed for years this strange pink plant, especially in wetlands, growing on old hummocks and things like that. I never saw any flowers on it, so I couldn't key it out. And I asked various botanists about this, and no one really knew, what the heck that was. And finally, this Norwegian sphagnologist, specialist in sphagnum, Kjell Ivar Flatberg, was visiting the Kenai, and I happened to point this out. We were out looking for sphagnum, of course, but I said, do you have any idea what that is? And he said, well, I couldn't remember the name of it, but he'd look it up when he got home. And so sure enough, he sent me the email to that. And it turns out this is another fungus. This is Exobasidium carstanii. Now, I particularly like this photograph because it shows the normal rosemary leaves there, the green ones, plus these infected pink ones. So once again, the fungus has taken over that cell differentiation machinery and produced, a quite different kind of leaf here. But I can assure you that we will see this summer out there. So poking around, particularly growing on hummocks there. But this photo is unusual because you see, kind of both parts, whereas, normally you're seeing separate things there, and you think, oh, this is two different plants, but really, if you dig down, they're connected. Okay, well, here's another favorite, sweet gale. Now, this one you can eat. This is used a lot like bay leaf, for stews and roasts and things like that. It has a very strong aroma. I mean, you can tell it at arm's length. And it's also a nitrogen fixer, or it has the bacteria Frankia in there that does the nitrogen fixing. The plant itself is not fixing the nitrogen. It's this bacterial partner. And we'll see this with alders quite a bit coming up. The sexes are separate here. So you've got, female flowers shown in the photograph there. And you can see the male flowers in the upper right part, and if you look at them, you can see the pollen there, the anthers are rupturing. But another interesting feature of this plant is that if you look at the leaves, especially with a hand lens, you can see these little gumdrops or resin drops underneath, which are called glands. I don't know why they're called glands. I mean, they're really just secreted by, the cells, and they're kind of out there. So there's the male flower. Again, you can see the pollen there. The anthers have ruptured and the pollen is just sitting there. Well, of course, here's our old favorite, probably the most common plant on the Kenai Peninsula or in Alaska, Calamagrostis canadensis, blue joint. And, this grows in a really wide range of habitat. I mean, it has the widest ecological amplitude, you might say, of probably any plant in Alaska. And it has kind of an open panicle of the head there. And then we compare that with a close relative here, reed canary grass. And this is a major invasive species. It's been planted for, crop use and also road stabilization and things like that. But once it gets loose, it really spreads. And I see this in the roadside ditches around Homer quite a bit. Now, this is kind of a good time of year to be looking at it because its leaves are wider than Calamagrostis, the blue joint. And they also stick out at right angles, as you can see in that lower right photograph there. I mean, that's a fairly distinctive character. The leaves are just, quite wide and perpendicular to the stem. And the head is also tighter, that panicle, than Calamagrostis. So there, the panicle is fully flowered out now, but again, you can see it's fairly tight compared to what the blue joint panicle would be like. And see how wide those leaves are. Well, these are examples of how it can take over a watershed. And there are places in the Anchor River where reed canary grass has got established, and in due time, those parts of the Anchor River will look like this, unless something is done about it. And it's not easy to do something about it, but it just, is an incredibly effective plant, you might say, and it can really grow very prolifically. Okay, I want to talk a bit about spruce because we have a lot of confusion about that on the Kenai because we're, especially in Homer, we're right in the middle of a hybrid zone here. So here we have white spruce, and if you went up to Soldotna, for instance, and further north, you would see that this is what the pine cone, or pardon me, the spruce cones look like on the spruce trees, and it's white spruce. And notice that the scales here are very solid looking. They have a very solid rim to them. But you can see on the map there where the red arrow is pointing that they're really rare on the southern Kenai. Okay, well, another important spruce species is black spruce, and we don't have really hardly any of that in the Homer area. But again, if you go up to Soldotna and the central Kenai Peninsula, you'll see this is the dominant spruce in the wetlands, particularly. It's very wet tolerant, and it grows in a lot of the fens, and it's invading in those fens as they dry out, and in due time, many of the fens up there will be just wall to wall, dog hair black spruce. The cones are a lot smaller, but the defining character, at least for me is the hairs on the stem. So here's a twig in the lower right, and you can see those hairs there. And our white spruce or Lutz Sitka spruce, really don't have those hairs in any significant amount. Well, okay, Sitka spruce now is really what you find across the bay, pretty much, and point south, Sitka, Kodiak, and so forth. And notice that the cones here have a very papery kind of edge, an erose margin. It's not at all solid looking, and you could bend those scales, quite easily. So this goes all the way down southeast Alaska into British Columbia and into Washington as well. It's very much a coastal species. Well, okay, then we have the hybrid. And even though these photos are from Denmark, they could have been from Homer. Well, it turns out both Sitka and our hybrid called Lutz have been widely planted in Europe and the United Kingdom. I remember driving through Ireland and seeing a stand of spruce, and I thought, boy, that looks familiar and whatnot. And I went over and looked at them, and yeah, they certainly did look familiar. They looked exactly like this and whatnot. Well, it turned out that they'd probably been transplanted from around here somewhere. The tree's been very successful growing there because of a similar climate. So you can see the photo in the upper right, a very spreading form there. That's an open grown tree there without really much competition. And so it's spread out its arms quite a bit. But the cone scales are intermediate between the hard, solid scales, the white spruce, and the very erose margin, papery scales of the Sitka spruce. And you could see, if you put them side by side, you can see 3 different intermediate grades, and then a real expert can see maybe 5 intermediate grades. And I don't have any good photos that show that, but they do. It is a hybrid, and so you can see that intermediate character in the cones that we pick up around here. Well, with white spruce, one of the distinguishing features is the leaf bases, and this is from not white spruce, but a similar spruce species, and you can see how there's the green part of the needle, the leaf, but then there's the brown part, which is fastened down, on the stem. And if you're careful, you can actually peel the needle off and get that brown base with it. And that is called a decurrent leaf base. And it's, really quite characteristic. Okay, so now here's a black spruce twig, and the leaf bases are sort of decurrent underneath there, but you can't see it because of the black hairs very well. And the hairs, start out red, and then they turn black after the year. Is another detail of that hair. So in the Homer area, where we don't have black spruce significantly, we have a lot of white spruce growing in the wetlands because the wetlands have dried out enough that now what is normally an upland, species can grow out there in the wetland. And they're kind of pathetic looking because they're really, it's too wet for them to grow well. But you think, oh, that's a black spruce growing there. But then when you go and look at it carefully and look at the twigs, you say, there's no hairs on these twigs. And these are white spruce. And if you look at the cones and so forth, you can see, yeah, indeed, that is a white spruce hurting out here in what was a wetland, but it's now dry enough that it can grow there. Okay, well, enough on the spruce. So here is another fun plant that we will see, the sundew. It has all these sticky hairs out there, and insects get stuck on these sticky hairs. And the plant is interested in nitrogen. Generally our environments around here, and especially the wetlands, are very nitrogen poor. So plants use all sorts of systems like the Frankiobacteria to fix nitrogen. In this case, they're catching insects that have protein and they're digesting that and they're getting nitrogen out of the protein. I will have to say that I don't think sundew really depends on this because it's very rare that I ever see a bug stuck on the sundew. I mean, keep an eye open for this, and maybe I just don't come at the right season, the bug season or whatnot. But generally, I don't see bugs. But every now and then there'll be a fly on there. They do produce a pretty little white flower here, but you won't see that too often. But that's in the lower right-hand side, the flower sticking up. Okay, so there are two forms of that. The round one is rotundifolia, rotund, and then the elongate one here is called anglica. And that there's a picture of the white flower in the middle photo there. Okay, well, horsetails are something we'll definitely need a lot of, and it's good to be able to tell the basic differences. So we've had our normal flush of horsetails this spring, growing along the roadsides and really just about everywhere. So first comes up the fertile form, the upper left-hand corner. These are the ones with the sporangia on top that release the spores, and when they get ripe, you can flick them with your finger and you'll see a big puff of spores come off. These guys are not doing photosynthesis at all, and they die after a couple of weeks, and then you might say the normal form comes up, the summer form, which is basically the sterile form. These have extensive underground roots, rhizomes, and they're amazingly effective as plants. Now, the branches are usually single branches and not branched again. Okay, well, now here's one that is a wetter one that often is in standing water. Fluviatale, I mean, basically means to do with streams or swamps or something. And you can see how hollow this stem is. So if you grab this stem here, it crushes immediately, presses flat. It's just totally hollow. And these usually have the sporangia up on top here. So there's not a difference between a fertile form and a sterile form here. And again, the leaves are, the branches are unbranched here. Well, okay, then we come to one that has more branches. And this is a more delicate one here, the meadow horsetail as it's called. But you can see it has a lot more branches. But again, they typically are single branches, not branched. Okay, now we come to Sylvaticum, which is distinctly, very branched. And you can see all of these little sub branches, coming off here, and very good character. Well, this one here looks kind of more like steel wool. It's growing close to the ground. This is typically a forest floor plant, and it's unbranched, and it's just the only one that has this sprawling, wiry character to it. There's really none of the other horsetails look like this. Okay, now here is another one that is living in water, but it has a very thick-walled stem. So if you grab this stem here and squeeze it, you'll see that it doesn't squeeze very well. I mean, it's more like a tube or a pipe. And typically it doesn't have any branches. Okay, well, that's horsetails. An old favorite here, low bush cranberry. This is one that you probably have gone picking for in the fall. It makes wonderful jam. You can make a chutney from this, which is quite good. Yeah, just a wonderful, wonderful plant. It has these, kind of rigid, shiny leaves. There's nothing else that has a leaf that looks quite like that. Well, here's an old favorite of mine, Daphne colliculata, or leather leaf. And again, this has the resin drops underneath. I don't have a good photograph showing this, but if you take a hand lens or a microscope and look at that, you'll see that it looks like it's just covered with gumdrops underneath. I had a dog, a black lab, for many years, and I gave it the name Daphne colliculata. And I'd see kids, kids ask, "Oh, what's your dog's name?" And I'd say, Daphne colliculata. And that would stop them. They would try and pronounce that and it would just come out totally weird. But I thought it was a great name for a dog. Yeah. Okay, well, interesting story here. So here's Barkley willow. This is the most common willow that you see, great moose food and so forth. But a lot of times it has this strange rose on top. And this is not at all a member of the rose family. I mean, this is a member of the willow family here. So one wonders, how in the world do you get a rose growing on a willow? Well, it turns out there is a fly in the Cecidomyidae family that burrows in and eats the terminal bud of this. Now, like many plants, the willow has, well, like here at the top of the stem is the growth zone. So, most plants grow from the top, unlike people. I mean, people, grow kind of uniformly on all sides, but, plants typically grow at the top. And so there's an area up there called the apical meristem, where the cells are actively dividing and the plant's getting longer. Well, if something eats that terminal bud, it loses its capacity to grow more stem, woody tissue, and the stem stops eliminating. But the leaves, on the other hand, continue to come out, even though the stem is no longer elongating. Now, leaves are typically in a spiral going around the plant, although some plants have maybe paired, opposite leaves, but with what's called alternate leaves, the leaves are actually in a spiral wound around the plant, and this makes what's called a Fibonacci spiral. Well, okay, let's say you stop the stem from elongating. The leaves continue to emerge, and they emerge in a spiral. So in this rosebud here, the leaves are all, spirally arranged. But this is not at all a flower. I mean, this is a gall. Once again, this fly has managed to sort of derail, at any rate, the normal growth process. I mean, it's not really a gall in the sense that it's produced, different kinds of structures, but it's just, stopped the normal elongation of the stem. Dominic Collette, naturalist here in the Kenai, has studied this quite a bit, and he has also studied the parasites that affect the gall larvae. So the fly lays its eggs on the bud, a little maggot is produced, the larva, And along comes a little wasp and deposits an egg inside that larva. And the egg doesn't hatch out immediately. The larva, burrows into the bud and overwinters. And then in the next spring, that egg inside the larva hatches, and the wasp larva now eats the fly larva from the inside out. Um, very effective form of parasitism there. But with broccoli willow, these large leaves down here at the base of the flowers are often a fairly distinctive character on that. Here are some of Dominic's drawings. And this is for moose, one of their favorite foods, especially in the winter. Okay, another old favorite here, crowberry. Produces these blackberries. Now they don't have a whole lot of flavor, but if you're out picking blueberries, you can pick these as well, and kind of enlarge your supply of berries that way, and they will be quite consumable, right with the blueberries. So again, separate flowers, male and female flowers. You can see the anthers here have not opened and the pollen has not been released on these. Well, one of the main invaders of the wetland areas, the peatlands, that we'll see is dwarf birch. And this typically has a pretty round leaf here. This is not a perfect example. I mean, sometimes the leaves are even rounder. Again, in birches, the sexes are separate, but on the same plant. So here are the male, the pollen-bearing flowers up here, and here are the female or seed-bearing plants. Well, a close cousin now is resin birch, but you can see the leaf bases here have a more wedge-shaped character to them. Now, these things all hybridize, and sometimes it's very hard to tell which one you are looking at. Okay, interesting story here. So a lot of logging occurred in the native areas, native corporation areas east of the Nulchik. So this is a picture taken a couple of years ago of an area that was logged in the 1990s. And here we've got birch shrubs coming in now, and there's a birch tree. The loggers were not interested in birch, so they left them standing and they just went after the spruce. Okay, now looking in more detail. So this is a young birch tree, but notice that it's been heavily browsed here. You can see how it's been, nipped off at numerous places by the moose. And now it's producing this white pepperific acid scaling. And this is an anti-herbivory compound that's made to discourage the moose from eating it. Now, it's not poisonous, but it's definitely a palatability reducer for both moose and also snowshoe hares. So this is a chemical defense that makes the plant less attractive for browsing. So in this particular plant, you can see, okay, it's been browsed some, but it's not been completely eaten. So it's definitely succeeded in preserving itself there with these scales. And if it didn't have those scales, the whole thing would have been eaten. Now this stuff is kind of a granular sandy material. And I remember I came from Wisconsin originally, and I used to go up to northern Wisconsin and take sauna baths with my Finnish friends up there. And the Finns love to collect a bunch of birch branches and then go into the sauna and sort of whip themselves with that to get the blood flowing. And you know, this was a part of the sauna ritual. And then I came to Alaska and was taking a sauna at a friend's place, and then thought, oh, I need to collect some victa, as they call it. And so I collected some birch, and I went in and I start, you know, flailing myself with these things, and I get the sandy material all over my skin. What is going on here? I couldn't believe it. Well, somehow, I don't know whether we have a different variety of birch here or there are not as many things eating birch in Wisconsin, but at any rate, don't bother trying this Finnish custom in Alaska. You'll just get covered with this white sand. And I mean, it's not particularly toxic or anything like that, but it's totally annoying. So here you can see it in more detail. And just look around Homer at some birch shrubs that are available for the moose, and you'll see this. Okay, looking at alders. Now we've got several kinds of alders, and again, this can be a little tough. A lot of our alders, especially in the drier areas, are Sitka alder. You know, they've got this kind of double serration along the edge. And then we also have thin-leafed alder, which can look pretty similar, but when the leaves are mature, they are definitely thinner. At this time of year, it's kind of tough to tell, but when they're mature, you know, you can see that, yeah, that leaf is definitely thinner. Now, probably the most distinguishing character has to do with the cones here, or the fruits. So you can see that these have, you know, quite short stems. The pedicels here are quite short. And if we go back and we look at the Sitka alder, they have longer stems. But I will have to say, looking around Homer, I can't always tell the difference just on the basis of that. And I don't know whether they hybridize or whatnot, but a lot of the plants, especially growing down closer to the beach, tend to have these pretty short ones. Now, if you go to the Calvin and Coyle Trail along there, which is going through, you know, a pretty wet area, you'll see good examples of the thin-leaf alder. So that's probably a safe place to start if you're trying to learn to distinguish these two types. There is also a green alder, which really has, you know, much less serration along the leaves, but it's pretty rare. It's much more an interior plant. But these leaves are pretty distinct, and they really don't look like anything we have around here. Well, alders are an important nitrogen fixer, or more to the point, they support this bacteria called Frankia. Now, Frankia is a bacteria that forms filaments. You know, this doesn't look like the normal bacteria you think of. You know, it's rods or you know, round and whatnot. But this is a filamentous bacteria. They can form a spore when conditions are bad. They will kind of tuck up and you know, form a spore, which is more resistant to environmental, you know, freezing and heat and things like that. Well, again, Frankia is one of these plants that is able to take over the cell division, the cell differentiation machinery in its host. So we're talking about the roots now in the alder, and it will grow these nodules on it like this. So these are typically the brown nodules. They're definitely a gall that is, you know, not what the normal root would produce. But, and here's, you know, a large one. This is a woody tissue that's been, you know, cut in half here. Well, Frankia fixes nitrogen and helps the alder grow. So we got, two situations here in both of these panels. The soil was not fertilized. No nitrogen was added. But these plants on the left have the Frankia nodules. They're pretty small on these little seedlings, but they will get bigger. But they are fixing nitrogen here, and the plants are loving it. They're growing quite well. But these guys over here have not been inoculated with Frankia, and they're still growing. So they're somehow getting enough nitrogen out of the unfertilized soil, to grow. But they obviously grow a whole lot better when they have Frankia there to help out. The nitrogen cycle is, pretty important thing. I mean, what we've been talking about is going on over here on the left now. So nitrogen from the air, which is like, 80% of the air is nitrogen. I mean, that's being fixed now by the bacteria, and it's going back and it's feeding the plant here. And some of that nitrogen is going to soil bacteria, which can also fix nitrogen. And in that case, they are producing ammonia, and then ammonia is being nitrified and ultimately turned into nitrate, which can go to feed plants here. The nitrate can also be denitrified and pumped out as nitrogen into the atmosphere. When things die or poop and whatnot, the decomposers go to work on them, and they are producing ammonia, which is then going into the cycle here. But ultimately, it's all going back into the atmosphere, and then it's getting picked up again by these nitrogen fixing bacteria. Okay, I want to kind of wrap up, talk a bit about lichens. This is one of my favorite topics, and then we could talk a lot about that. But if you click on these links here, they will take you to various good websites, with lots of pictures and keys for identifying lichens and bryophytes, mosses, liverworts as well. Probably the best book for lichens is this big one here. I mean, this pretty expensive book. Now it's about 2.5 inches thick, and it has gorgeous photographs in it. Erwin Brodo is one of the top lichenologists in North America, and then the Sharnoff folks were the photographers. Another favorite book here. This is about mosses. Robin Wall Kimmerer. Some of you may have read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Here, really a delightful book. This is an earlier book that she wrote on mosses, and she's a Native American writer, but she's a professor of ecology, plant ecology, well, moss ecology, basically, and just loves her topics. And I would be thrilled to get her up for a workshop there. She seems like a very neat person. Okay, some lichens. Any of the lichens that we'll see out in the wetlands will be growing on dead wood, stumps or logs or things like that, or maybe on top of hummocks. They like kind of a dry substrate generally. So here's cladonia, and it takes many forms, and so it's always a good guess that what you're looking at is a cladonia. They have just the wide variety of growth forms, and typically the ones that are ornamented with red, the red apothecia, the spore-bearing tissue. I think just most things out there that have the red, showy red on it are going to be cladonias. The Growing Glacier outwash plain, very dry area is a great place to see lots of cladonias growing as well. And then we have reindeer moss. Now this is Cladina. Now some authors also put Cladina in with Cladonia, but traditionally they're separated, two different genera here. And this is important food for reindeer. In the wintertime, reindeer up in the mountains will find an area where the snow is windswept and fairly thin, and they will paw down through that, or crater as it's called, and they will be eating reindeer moss. And that's pretty well what gets them through the winter. Kind of, well, basically they depend on getting fattened up well enough to get through the winter, with just this very modest addition. Well, you'll see this, especially in the woods, a lot. This is Peltidra there, and it has these little round buttons. I see epithece is the wrong term. Cephalodia is what these are called. So lichens, typically have both an algal component and a fungal component. So the green part here would have a green algae and a fungal partner as well. But these little buttons have a blue-green algae or cyanobacteria in them, probably a nitrogen fixer. I'm not sure, but many of the cyanobacteria are nitrogen fixers. So on this particular species, these little buttons come off quite easily. And I think most of the ones that you see around here are this Britannica one. The other one is called Peltidra aphthosa, and the buttons on those don't come off. They're very firmly fixed on there. But other than that, the two species are pretty much the same. And this is another common one. Again, see this growing on the forest floor or on hummocks and whatnot. It can be sprawling patches of this, 5-10 feet wide. And there aren't any of those little buttons on this. So that's one thing that distinguishes them quite quickly. But Nephroma. And old man's beard, the horsehair lichen. Again, many species of this, but this is a common one here. And if you look at it carefully with the hand lens, you can see these white lesions. Effectively, I mean, there is a skin on this, an epidermis that is broken, and the white that you see in there are the fungal cells that make up the interior part of the stem. So this is just like little holes or lesions in the stem there. And this particular species has a lot of those, and they're quite distinctive. But this could be an important food for caribou. Again, some of the caribou will come down out of the mountains when we have a lowland herd of caribou in the central Kenai here. And during the winter, they are plucking this stuff off the trees and eating it. And that's kind of their main food source. Okay, well, last but not least, I mean, this is probably the easiest lichen to find. If you look on just about any tree around here, you will see Parmelia sulcata growing. And it's just extremely widespread, and it's got a pretty distinctive look to it, leafy, but the leaves are often ridged like this, this ridged texture to them, so that they're pretty easy to tell. Okay, I think I've gotten through it. Sometime later, I want to tell you more about peatland development and what I found out about that, how it's developed on the Kenai since the end of the last glacial period. But that will just have to be put in the to be continued department. So, okay.
Great, thank you so much, Ed. Those are all such interesting species, and a lot of them familiar and some unfamiliar. So look forward to going out and surveying peatlands throughout the summer and see which of those we find out there. And I know there are a variety of different types of peatlands in this area and ways that they have formed. So I think a follow-up on, that those local peat formations would be really fascinating too. So at this point, does anybody have any questions to ask Ed? You can either drop them in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Ed any questions that you have. I think if I have a couple, Ed, and one was like, I may have read this somewhere about the sundew catching the insects, and that I'm not totally confident this is true, but that once they catch an insect on that little spatula, that spatula coils in towards the base of the plant and dies. So sort of similar to like a Venus flytrap snapping shut. That would be a reason why you wouldn't see a lot of bugs stuck in there if each time a bug got stuck, it coiled up.
Well, it certainly does sound like Venus's flytrap, but I've not read that, and I can't say that I've noticed it either. It might be fun to put a few flies on one and then see what the response to that is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do see bugs in them sometimes, but they're usually very tiny, like little gnats or little almost no-see-ums, or just these like itty bitty little insects.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question if no one else wants to jump in. You were talking about the birch's response to a rivery and releasing that pepperum resin.
Pepperific acid.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, perfect acid. And you mentioned it's not really toxic, but it is a deterrent. I'm just thinking about the moose we have around here and how rough of a winter they've had, and they seem to be just browsing really undesirable foods. And I guess that brings to question, is the birch that they're browsing even further degraded by the fact that they've been munching on it so much?
Well, the birch around here are certainly heavily hammered. And you're hard pressed to find a really healthy, nice straight up birch like you might find it up around, say, Fairbanks, which has a lot more birch and a lot fewer moose. So all of that coppicing of them, shall we say, is tough on the tree, and they produce a kind of a distorted growth form compared to their normal growth form. And they often have, heart rot in the middle. So they typically don't live to be very old here. And you can see a gradient as you go north. They get healthier and healthier as you go north on the Kenai, and there's more birch and less browsing. But around Homer, there's really not much birch, so they tend to be extremely heavily browsed here. But again, as I say, it's not a toxin. And there were experiments done in Fairbanks, for instance, with snowshoe hares, and snowshoe hares in pens, would be offered the birch with the pepperific acid on it, and basically they would more or less starve to death there rather than eat it. Even though if it was ground up and put in a pellet or something like that, they might eat it that way and wouldn't be badly affected by it. But it really offended their sense of taste to the point that they were prepared to starve. And I remember John Bryant was a professor there, and he developed the theory that the hair cycle was essentially driven by the papyrific acid scaling on birch. And well, to willows, there's a similar anti-herbivory compound. I forget what it is, but again, a chemical defense like that. And you know, after the browsing stops, it takes several years for the plant to kind of get back to normal and stop producing, you know, all of this scaling. And Bryant figured that was enough of a lag that you know, the snowshoe hares would have time to regrow their population, you know, before the food got too toxic or too offensive to eat again. And that theory, you know, made a lot of sense in Fairbanks, which has a very strong hare cycle, you know, and not very many moose. But you know, it would never have gotten off the ground on the Kenai, which has a lot of moose and really. You know, all of the available birch, you know, tends to get browsed pretty heavily here. So it's typically always got papyrific acid scales on it. So I don't think that theory went too far, but it was an interesting idea.
Seal, I just saw you put a question in the chat box about pollinators. What are some of the common pollinators that you see in peatland ecosystems, and are there any specialized pollination associations?
Well, you know, a lot of the trees and shrubs are wind pollinated, essentially. So you know, they're not dependent on any pollinator. I think I mentioned that the strange example of that dung moss that produces the little umbrella. Now this is not being pollinated; it produces spores, you know. But it's really like the only moss that I've ever heard of that has a distinct smell that attracts insects to it, and it smells like poop. I mean, it's living on poop, you know. So the insects, you know, come and they pick up the spores and they transfer those spores to another pile of poop somewhere else. A really odd kind of phenomenon. But other specialized pollinators, boy, nothing comes to mind, Seal. There may well be, but I can't pull any up.
Wonder if Dominique's book on insects would be a good place to look for that.
Probably would, yeah. His book on the insects of South Central Alaska, I think it's called. Yeah, definitely would be a good place.
All right. Are there any other questions folks have? Okay.
Yeah, I'll throw it
I
out
think
there.
Shauna had a question before mine.
Oh, go ahead, Cameron, and I'll look for the other one.
Okay. The spruce broom rust, does that target or occur on certain spruce species more than others? I have an intuition that I see it on a lot more black spruce. Maybe that's because they're in boggy areas and the moisture there makes them a little more susceptible. You know, I'm up here in Anchorage and it's relatively dry in most parts, especially up on the hillside and whatnot. But there are many boggy areas here too, and it seems like a lot of the brooming happens in the black spruce. Is there a sort of a comorbidity there, or a set of environmental circumstances that make it more likely?
Boy, I don't think so. You know, down here, I guess I would be inclined to say that I see it more in the or lot spruce forest down here, but you know, maybe that's just an accident of my, you know, spending more time in those forests. It's an interesting question, but I am not aware that. I mean, I think that it occurs in all the spruce species that we have here. Yeah.
Maybe without closer inspection, I see that occurring on some of the more ratty looking ones, and I automatically assume they're black spruce without taking a closer look, since they tend to be a little more scraggly.
Well, that's worth taking a closer look, because down here in Homer, where we have very little black spruce, it's very easy to think you're looking at a black spruce when it's just an emaciated butt spruce, growing in an overly wet spot. Yeah.
Okay, so did anybody else have any other questions? Oh. Hi, Sue. Sue, you just arrived right at the end.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Doggone it.
But it's okay, it's recorded. I'm just gonna go ahead and stop the recording now.